Well, welcome back to American Catechism, episode number 66 by Stab the Dragon Productions. Coming to you from Fort Worth, Texas on Saturday, June 20th, 2026, where it is currently 88 degrees. In my American Catechism videos, I like to study American history, Western Civ, some book and movie reviews, current events, Bible studies, and a variety of whiskeys I enjoy. Today is episode number 4 of a Bible study from Genesis 14 and the story of the kings of the east destroying Sodom and taking Lot and his family captive. Last time we looked at verse 13 and the story of that one unnamed man who escaped the POW situation and went to Abram for help. And so we're going to continue now with verse 14. But that verse last time was very practical, but it also presented some of the gospel message there, because what we see is this escaped POW. It was, I'm sure, a very difficult, harrowing experience. He had to survive captivity. He had to run away, probably in the middle of the night. Maybe he had to fight for his freedom. I don't know. But he went to Abram, and so somehow he knew Abram, knew where to find him. and so practically, there's a message there about survival and about seeking help. But theologically and gospel-oriented wise, it talks about he knew who to go for salvation. Jesus is our only hope for salvation in a fallen world. The world takes us captive. The devil takes us captive. The only one we can go to for help, the only one who can rescue us, is what Abram points to, Christ. So, today we're going to look at verse 14, and Abram's trained men. Here again we see a remarkably practical passage, as well as a rich gospel message. Now, people are going to love the gospel message here, but that practical part, watch out. Here's the main point, though. Abram, the friend of God, established, trained, and equipped a militia from the men in his household to defend his household and his property, and in this case, defeat a foreign army. Real men in space and time took up arms and waged a just war against their enemies, and God blessed them. God blessed Abram. May it be so again today. Amen. So first, let's read our passage from Genesis 14. In the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goam, these kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and king of Bela, that is, Zoar. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Shava Kiriathim, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. That's a lot of tough things. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites, who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out, and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim with Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goam, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. Now, the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their provisions, and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. All right, so let's look at Abram's response to the escapee, or the POW. Abram heard what the escapee said. He received that message. He listened to the man, took it to heart. This man was an escapee, a refugee. He had traveled far under extreme circumstances, likely showed up poorly dressed, dirty, half-starved, and very desperate. The man had likely been brought to Abram by one of Abram's own men, and there likely had already been some kind of a preliminary interrogation. Whichever one of Abram's men found the guy and listened to his story, he thought it believable and urgent and brought him directly to Abram. Abram's man had some discernment, therefore, and wisdom to not just ignore the man's story and situation. So he likely fed him something, bread and water maybe. Shows that Abram had good men working for him. So Abram heard the man, listened to him. Now this is a wealthy, powerful sheik. He was down to earth enough to listen to this straggler, this refugee, and take him seriously. And not everybody would do that. I'm too powerful. I don't want to listen to this poor beggar. Just feed him and send him on his way. Since we know nothing about the unnamed man other than that he knew of Abram, he knew where to find Abram, we can't know for sure what exactly happened here. But I think it's possible that this man had either accompanied Lot, he was one of Lot's men maybe, to Abram before, and so perhaps Abram was going to recognize him. Maybe he was a grocer from Sodom who did business with Abram for bringing sheep or cattle to the market in Sodom. Abram was a wealthy, successful businessman, so lots of people would have known him. He raised cattle, sheep, goats, camels, and he would sell those animals for profit to the businesses in the surrounding cities. We just don't know anything other than that. This unnamed man knew Abram, and Abram listened to him. And when I say that Abram listened to the man, I mean he believed what he said and then took action on what he heard. So Abram led forth his trained men. Now the word for led forth is a military term from the ancient world that means to muster or empty out or unsheath. It's like unsheathing your sword, pulling an arrow out of your quiver, or sounding the alarm and mustering your troops out of their barracks. So this is a clear military word. And it means that Abram here is being referred to as a warrior, and his actions are warlike. The implication is that Abram and his men had drilled for this, maybe even had prior experience at this, because it was a rough world. There's not a whole lot of law and order going on there. So think of how often military raids and wars happen all throughout Scripture. A lot. The Scriptures depict a very violent time. They show God's people living and having to deal with violence all around. Notice also that it was Abram who led forth these 318 trained men. He was the leader, the colonel, if you will. Abram was a warrior leading men he knew, that he had funded, that he had trained, off to chase down an army. Now this contrasts greatly with the Abram that we have seen so far, the one who failed embarrassingly in Egypt, who seemed to be weak towards his nephew, giving him that well-watered valley, and it goes against the grain of how modern-day American evangelicals even think. So I think we need to view Abram in this situation much like perhaps our American forefathers who fought in the colonial Indian wars along the frontier, or in the Revolutionary War where you had local militias and small towns all throughout that were trained and equipped, ready for war on a minute's notice. Think about the men on Lexington Green, or the Rough Riders by Teddy Roosevelt in the Spanish-American War. These were not professional soldiers. Professional armies were not yet a thing in world history in Abram's day. second millennium BC. There would be conscripts, there would be militia, a king, and his men, like you see in Homer's Iliad, which takes place hundreds of years after Abram's time, in which the militaries would be kind of a gaggle of volunteers or draftees. Abram is much like Achilles here, who is the warrior of the Myrmidons, or Odysseus, the warrior king of Ithaca. So Abram was the warrior king of his tribe. So let's look more at these trained men. The text says that he mustered 318 trained men. I wish we had more of an idea about how they were trained, with what arms they were equipped. Were they all some sort of cavalry, or were they infantry, or mixed? I tend to think, due to the nature of the chase that Abram is involved with, and the fact that Abram was a rancher, herdsman, that his men were probably mounted. There may have been a mix of camels, donkeys, horses. I don't know. 300, like Lawrence of Arabia, shows up riding camels, right? 318 could easily be divided into 3 troops of 100 men each, and then you got a headquarters element. So what were they armed with? This is the Bronze Age. This is not even the Iron Age. And so swords are going to be of bronze. Spears would be tipped with bronze. Some archers, maybe some slingers. And then as far as armor goes, it's probably going to be dried leather, which is pretty tough. Maybe some shields with a wood frame and leather coating, maybe even wicker. Some may have had some bronze in their armor. But you see, outfitting an armed force of any size requires considerable expense. In the ancient Greek world, only the well-off could afford the armor of the Greek hoplite infantrymen, like we see in the Iliad, and only the very wealthy could afford a horse or a chariot team. So that's why when you read through the Iliad and you see battles happening, these soldiers very quickly strip the dead of their armor and their weapons, because that's expensive stuff. I mean, that's how, they equip their own men, by stripping the enemy dead. Training in those days would be fairly basic. You're not going to have a whole lot of time for training. Cavalry techniques, if you're having a mounted force, would include learning to follow signals, learning to give signals, basic maneuvers, and you might have target practice with spears and bows and arrows and swords. Some maneuvering together is going to be essential. Now, we have no word on the experience level of these trained men. How many engagements had they previously fought, if any? Now, judging from the success of this operation, the duration of it, the length of it, the fact that there was a night operation, a night fight there at the end, that's some considerable experience and or training going on there. A lot of coordination there. A lot of night operations are not easy. And so maybe they had fought some battles against brigands, bandits, and cattle rustlers. You don't just take a bunch of inexperienced, untrained men into a long-distance raid and fight a night battle without some type of prior experience and good training. Now, military training for warriors is not like some gun hobbyists going to the gun range and shooting paper targets. Training for war is physically and psychologically demanding, very stressful, as you actually prepare to kill people. And so combat in the ancient world, what was that like? Well, it involved sticking sharp pointed spears into people, swinging at them with swords that would lop off arms, disembowel them, or cut off heads. You'd get sprayed with arterial blood at close range. You would step in the guts of your friends and enemies. This is what Abram, the friend of God, had trained his men to do. Modern evangelicals don't want to hear this or even think about it. Let's apply this a little bit. The gospel application is this. Abram, I think, points us to Christ, who had his 12 trained men, obviously the disciples, and he sent them out on preaching missions. There they would proclaim the gospel, they'd perform works of healing, rescuing the perishing, much like Abram was going to be rescuing Lot and the people of Sodom. Now, the world is opposed to Christ and the gospel, and so the world is capturing people and hurting people. So, this is spiritual warfare. They are at war against the kingdom of God. And Jesus is sending us out to rescue souls, to bring them in from being enslaved to sin and the devil, bring them back to Christ. So gospel work is a type of warfare. You are fighting the powers of this world, the philosophies of this world with the gospel. The work can be deadly and dangerous. Missionaries, preachers get arrested, they die, get sent to prison, get persecuted. You share the gospel at work and you can get reported to HR, lose your job. Today in Great Britain and Canada and other parts of Western Europe, you can go to jail for preaching the gospel and lose everything. We are in a spiritual war that has consequences in the here and now, as well as for all eternity. Britain is being conquered by Islam, and if things continue in another 20 years or so, the church in Britain is going to be underground, persecuted, outlawed, and outnumbered. Now, do you think that can't happen here in America? Yes, it can. We need imitators of Christ who will train and lead others to be gospel warriors, preachers, ministers, apologists, who will rescue the perishing. Christ is mustering out his army, and we must answer that divine call, prepare for the spiritual war by studying the scriptures and training in evangelism. All right, now there's another application. This is more practical as well. And this one's going to be uncomfortable, goes against the current evangelical grain. Should Christians be participants in militia? Should Christians train in self-defense, train with guns and weapons, join the military? Every time we hear of militias today in the news, it's in an overwhelming negative way. We see some weird, whacked-out race-based group. They have a Nazi flag, and they're anti-black, anti-Semitic wackos, whatever. We don't need anything like that, obviously. But when you read history books, you do see local communities in the American colonies, along the frontier especially, that had organized militia to defend them against the Indians, or the French and Indians, or the English. In Texas, there was a defense against the Mexicans. These were largely Christian men who participated, led, supplied, and equipped those militias. Were they wrong to do so? I think not. It's part of our history. A lot of positive results from that. I think God blessed that. By the early 20th century, though, with the closing of the frontier, militias became more federalized. You get the National Guard, organized at the state level, yet they can be controlled by the federal level. And this replaced the volunteer militia. Now, as a teenager, I was part of the Civil Air Patrol, which is a civilian auxiliary of the United States Air Force, whose job was similar to that of a militia in some ways. We helped conduct search and rescue operations for downed aircraft. And in World War II, Civil Air Patrol civilians were flying airplanes along the shoreline looking for German submarines or infiltrators. Civil Air Patrol also had some duties with civil defense, disaster response, the Red Cross. You see some of the same things with the Boy Scouts, the old Boy Scouts. They had some similar duties, and the Red Cross, the ham radio operators. So a lot of the roles of militia have changed hands, and they're under different names now, but the roles are still out there to an extent. However, here's where it gets really uncomfortable. Oh, and even with police departments. A lot of police departments have a volunteer force. They are trained, but they're unpaid. And so they escort officers, they help fill in for officers. And so that it's There's a volunteer aspect that goes along with the police force as well. Same with fire. I mean, you got volunteer fire departments. So this idea of a militia, we need to broaden our horizons about what that means and say, yes, Christians can participate here. But here's where it gets really uncomfortable. In the American Revolution, the militia was used to fight against tyranny, bad government, oppressive bureaucrats. Christians in the militia helped win our freedom as a nation. Is there still a role for that today? If you think that our government cannot be oppressive, tyrannical, or evil enough to resist, just watch the news of what's happening in Canada, England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, France. You know, you've not been reading history if you think governments can't become tyrannical. Freedom is easily lost and it's hard to gain. If you watch the news with a critical biblical view, our country is deeply divided over fundamental issues, much like during the Revolution. The Revolution, there was a civil war aspect. About a third of the population were loyalists. They didn't want a revolution. They wanted to stay loyal to the king. And then there's the Civil War. You know, that's a black hole you could go down. But so there's all kinds of things in our history that say peaceful, beneficent governments are rare. I think there's coming a time when Christians will have to act like Abram and rescue the innocent from the clutches of evil men. I do not think our churches, pastors, theologians are anywhere near ready for this. Hence, American Catechism out here.